I'm Vanessa. I'm 22. I'm a student. I study sustainability and environmental management with, well, not with Marie because we don't study the same thing, but we both go to Leeds. And I guess my main focus is on depression and anxiety because that's kind of like what I struggle with the most. For me, like it's kind of like both of them manifest very differently, especially because like they're so kind of contrasting. Like depression for me, like, it really brings you down and makes it really low, and like you don't really care about anything. At least kind of like my symptoms. You kind of like numbed out, which is actually not what a lot of people think. A lot of people have this idea of like you're really sad, which wasn't my experience. And then anxiety kind of like really hypes me up, and I get really nervous, and like I'm really like on the go and like things like that. But yeah, I mean, I guess I started feeling the symptoms of depression when I was 13. So it's been like almost 10 years. Um, and yeah, I think for me, one of the main things was that it just like switched. Like I can't even really remember how it started. I just remember it started feeling really, really strange in my body, and like like I was 13, I was so young, I had no idea, especially because it's not really talked about. I had no idea. Like for me, depression was just like, oh, sometimes you're really sad and you spend some days crying on your couch and then it's better. And that was like all I knew. And for me, suddenly I had all these like weird things going on with me. Like I've always been someone that's super, super emotional. And suddenly like I was so numbed out. I didn't really care about anything. I've always been really motivated in school. And then suddenly like again, had no motivation whatsoever. I didn't want to hang out with friends, didn't want to do anything. And it was just really weird. I think it took me almost a year to actually figure out what was going on with me. Um, yeah, and that process was just so strange. Like I remember thinking, like, I don't know, maybe my soul left my body or whatever was going on because I just couldn't recognize myself. And it's just such a like feeling of like estrangement. Um, and yeah, and I think it was only through my own research that I actually started realizing like, okay, this is what's really going on with me. This really, really matters what I'm feeling. And that's when I kind of started struggling with me kind of trying to tell people like, hey, I'm depressed. And people be like, you're 13, you're not depressed, like you may be upset because you have too much homework or because a guy doesn't like you, but you're not depressed. And I'm like, no, I'm severely depressed. Like I'm really not okay. And people be like, no, it's fine. And I think it took me a couple years to actually feel like it was okay to even tell myself that I was depressed because, I would be countered with so many things like, oh, but, you live in such a peaceful part of the world and don't have any financial struggles. And your parents are not divorced and you don't have any issues. So, like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you so ungrateful and things like that. So that was a really big struggle. But I think there was a lot of power in like accepting that that's what that was what I was feeling and that was my narrative. And that's when I really started to think like, no, like I'm struggling with an illness and I have every right to like take care of myself. And that's really helped me a lot. And I think that was when I was around 15 or 16 that I had this really big switch. And with that, I really transferred it, like changing who I hang out with, what I do, like trying to trim my habits, which is something I still really like try to do, like what really nurtures me, what really makes me feel good. And that's really changed like my perception and like my journey with depression a lot. And yeah, that's when I actually started enjoying really talking about it because like what you do is so important. Like people don't talk about it. And it really like so many people struggle with it. And I think it was similar with anxiety. Anxiety is something I've always been really nervous. Like when I was younger, I had a lot of like nervous tics and things like that. And I've always been like, quite like an anxious person. I don't know how long I'd say I've been struggling with anxiety. For me, depression is something that like affects me on an everyday basis. While anxiety is something it flares up and goes down. But especially over the last 2-3 years, it's been like increased a lot. But yeah, I kind of had like the language to talk about it. But even then, like, for me, there is always like a certain perception of what a panic attack is. And it took me so long to actually like realize like what I was having was a panic attack. Like, just because there's, for me at least, what I encountered was just this one singular narrative and it didn't match with what I was feeling. So I felt like I had no right to say I was anxious. And once I actually started, I think it was me actually going to the doctor and talking to them about my depression that they were like, no, but a lot of the symptoms they're feeling, you also have anxiety, that really allowed me to be like, oh, okay. And then kind of like start thinking again about like, what can I do to like take care of myself and like help myself with that. Sorry, that was a
Yeah.
really long answer.
No, that's really, thanks for opening up about both of those things, because I think, like you said, they're really different, but they often come together for a lot of
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that, you know, is really helpful to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think speaking about it, and like you are speaking about the misconceptions, that there has to be a very obvious reason for the way you're feeling, when actually, you know, you might on the surface look like you have a perfect life but be really, really struggling inside. And I think
Yeah.
that's a lot of people's experience. I think that that's a really, really important point to like to highlight. So what would you say are the main things that you want to destigmatize about depression and anxiety and your experiences?
Like there is no type of person that has that. You know, if you think of someone depressed, you know, like you think of someone that's like wearing black all the time, super sad, and maybe doesn't have that many friends or whatever, and like, you know, I was like super outgoing and always laughing and things like that. And like sometimes you can try and compensate with that. Like you just don't know what someone's going through. Um, and I think that helps yourself with like accepting that as well, because once you realize like I don't have to fit into that certain type of person to have the certain type of feelings, then I can allow myself to feel that way. And I mean, there's so much, even if you look at the cultural aspect, because I mean, here in like for me, the experience in like Germany and the UK was like with these things, but then when I look back at like society in Brazil, it's like a whole different level where like people don't even believe it's a thing, you know? And like I guess in a society where so many people are struggling with poverty and everything, there's so much of a bigger stigma of like you have no right to feel upset and everything. And people think like, you know, you just want attention. I mean, I guess those things happen here in Europe as well, but I think it's a lot bigger there. I would say that like the stigma of talking about it is so much like it's more intense. Um, and just as well, like you don't. I think for me, one of the big things was like with depression, especially, was that for most of it, I didn't feel sad. I felt numbed out, and I had no connections to who I was before and like what I cared about. Um, and that was one of the big things for me, that I was for months, I was like, no, I'm not depressed because I'm not sad. Or I started trying to talk to people and they're like, oh, but you're not crying. I really see you crying. I was like, oh, well, I'm so numbed out. I can't even cry. I haven't cried for 2 years, which is really unhealthy. So that's the notion of it. And again, with anxiety, like you don't have to have these physical panic attacks of like having walls coming closer and like your heart rate. I mean, these can be symptoms, but anxiety can be so much milder as well. Like, you know, if you're anxious every day and if you feel like something's wrong every day, or if you're being like, you know, like overly precautious of everything, you're free, always think the worst that's going to happen to you, that can already be anxiety. Like, I've had so many experiences of people talking to me and like close friends of mine that I talk to on a regular basis, and they suddenly being like, after years, you know, I think I have anxiety, and I'm like, oh no shit, you know, like I can, I mean, they have to come to it in their own terms, and I don't want to like put labels on anybody, but like it's things that I really started to learn that like there are all these minimal signs, but again, because it's a spectrum, and we only tend to look at like the end of it, because people always tend to have this thinking of like, who's worse off than me, and I don't have the right to claim that for myself because there's people that are worse. We always look at the the most extreme examples, and then people be like, I don't have the right to go and talk to people, I don't have the right to go and accept all these resources because I'm not feeling that. But if you know, if you are, you are.
Yeah, I think you're so right that, you know, that often we're struggling and we don't even feel like our struggle is valid, so we feel like we've got to keep it to ourselves. So how do you think that people around someone who's struggling can help, like friends, family, loved ones? How can they be a healthy kind of impact on someone who's struggling?
um I think the first thing is always listen to what the person's telling you, like how they need help. That's a really, I think that's one of the best questions, just to ask someone like, how can I help you? Because for me, a lot of the time, it's not even like, I don't even want to talk about it, but so like for me, the thing that I think I wish the most especially when I'm like really, really down, feeling like really depressed, is like practical things. Like, I start feeling so guilty because I barely can get out of my bed. Like I'm someone, for me, it's really like my own personality in my depressed self is very contrasting. Like I really separate myself with that. Um, so like I'm not like I love tidy spaces. Like I said, I'm quite energetic. I'm ambitious in school. I'm outgoing. So you can tell my mental state if you walk into my room and it's a mess, or if I'm not eating healthy, I'm not eating well, if I'm not showering, if I'm like not being out there. Um, so it's things like that. Sometimes it just helps to like clean someone's room or like cook them a meal. For me, that's the biggest thing. Like when a friend is like, "Hey, I know you've really been struggling. Like I've made dinner extra. Do you want some?" And that's like maybe the first meal I've eaten in 2 days, and that is such a big help because again, that kind of takes away the guilt feeling of it. Because when you're already struggling and then you top, you're like, oh my God, my life's messed up. I'm not even eating enough. Like my room's a mess. I'm not doing assignments, things like that. And just having someone like help with those little things, like this, you just coming and like helping someone clean your room is such a big thing. Well, at least for me, that's one thing, like always listen to someone. And then there's the whole like, don't, like always value your friends' feelings. Always acknowledge what they're feeling. But also take care of yourself because it can be really hard as well listening to some. And I hate feeling like I'm a burden, and I hate feeling like I'm taking up all the all the space, because even though like sometimes I've been like I've had the experience of people telling me like, oh no, I've been struggling with this, but you've been struggling so much more, and I don't want to tell you this. And it's like, I appreciate that. And yes, of course, if I'm really down, always ask me, like if I have the capacity, but bring stuff up. It might actually even make me feel like I'm not, the like it normalizes things and it humanizes things. I think that's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, there's so much. Like, try not to take things personally. I mean, I'm a big believer in like
Yeah.
nothing, even outside of the mental health spectrum, like nothing that anyone really does is about you. Like that sounds harsh sometimes, but like we all have so many imprints, and we all have our like things that we struggle with, things that we love because of some reasons. And in most times, people are just trying to live. People are just trying to thrive and be happy. And we have so many reasons that we don't even understand why we're doing things. So like taking things personal. In most cases, when someone's letting you down, when someone's hurting you, when someone's upset, when someone's angry at you, it's normally something within them. Not saying it's never your fault, but it's something within them. And especially when someone is really, really struggling. Like, I don't know, like I had so many experiences when people are like, oh my God, you don't text me back, do you hate me, or things like that. And I'm like, no, like I don't have the energy right now, or like I'm so mentally preoccupied with something else. Like it's rarely ever anything relating to someone, or someone's like, oh, you're suddenly really cold. And I think when I'm really struggling already, then having put that burden of like someone really taking things personally, I really struggle with that. Like for me, that's really, and I understand, like I have compassion for it. I really understand that it isn't easy, but then like I said, I'd rather have someone being like, you're doing that and I'm really struggling with it, so I'm going to take my own space. Like that's completely okay. But like when I'm really struggling, having someone like put that on top of me and be like, oh, but because you're doing that, I'm like, it's really hard. So really, really try not to take things personally, because they really aren't.
I completely agree. I think that that's such an applicable like advice for lots of situations, not just with mental health. I think we're always responsible for our own kind of actions, and usually those actions and those feelings are coming from ourselves, not from other people. And I think that that's a huge distinction.
That's what I'm saying. Like once I started actually having a language for like what I was feeling, and actually understanding more, like I said, who I hung out with really, really changed. And that really benefited my mental health so much. And now I look around and most of my friends, especially like my close friends, are just people that tend to not take things personally, that really have this understanding of like, hey, things happen. Like you do you and I do I. And like when we meet and we merge together and it's all great and we really like nurture and grow from each other, but everyone has their own reasons. It's hard sometimes.
Well, thank you so much for opening up, despite it, like you say, being a hard conversation and one that's very stigmatized, which is why we're here.
Everyone has their own reasons. It's hard sometimes.
Well, thank you so much for opening up, despite it, like you say, being a hard conversation and one that's very stigmatized, which is why we're here. So thank you so much.